Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are plunging into one of the most controversial and frankly heartbreaking true crime cases in modern American history. We're talking about the brutal 1993 murders of three 8-year-old boys in West Memphis, Arkansas, and importantly, the subsequent rush to judgment that convicted three teenagers, known globally now as the West Memphis Three.
Yeah, this case is really a perfect storm, isn't it? It's where, moral panic collided head-on with what seems like serious investigative failure. And it all led to one of the most, stunning legal compromises we've ever really seen. We're going to trace the full 18-year journey here of Damien Echols, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin. These are three young men who always maintained their innocence, even while facing, the absolute worst sentences imaginable, life in prison, even the death penalty.
And those initial sentences were just devastating. Eccles condemned to death. Miskelly gets life plus, another 40 years tacked on.
Yeah.
And Baldwin also received life imprisonment. Almost immediately, though, people started questioning it. The whole judicial process came under scrutiny because the evidence, it just seemed painfully thin, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. There's a profound lack of actual physical evidence tying these specific teenagers to the victims.
Yeah.
It felt like it was driven more by public opinion, maybe. Almost a wave of cultural hysteria rather than objective fact.
Right. So our deep dive today, using the source material you provided us, is really focused on unpacking that whole saga. We need to meticulously look at the failures in that original investigation, how 21st century DNA tech really blew the lid off those failures, and then this incredibly complex legal maneuver, the Alford plea, that ultimately got them out. But, it didn't exactly close the case.
No, not at all. And that Alford plea is so central to understanding how this ended, or rather how it didn't end with a clear resolution. It's not a full exoneration, and it's really critical, I think, that we define what it actually is. It explains the limits of their freedom.
Okay, so let's break that down. The Alford plea. What exactly does it mean in practice?
Well, think of it as a kind of calculated exchange. It's a very specific legal tool. It lets a defendant stand up in court and explicitly say, I am actually innocent. I did not commit this crime.
Mm-hmm.
But in the very next breath, they have to acknowledge that the prosecution believes they have enough evidence that could convince a jury to convict them.
So it's basically, I didn't do it, but I admit you have a case that might win, so I'll take this deal.
Exactly. It's the defendant saying, essentially, I maintain my innocence, but I cannot risk going through another trial, especially if the death penalty is on the table. It trades that assertion of innocence for freedom, but crucially, the conviction technically stays on their record, albeit for lesser charges in this case.
Yeah.
It's complex.
Okay, so with that key piece of legal context established, let's go back. Back to the very beginning, May 5th, 1993, West Memphis, Arkansas.
This is the day everything changes. Three 8-year-old boys, Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, they vanish. They were second graders, best friends, Cub Scouts, just kids, reported missing around 7 p.m. that evening.
And the location they disappeared from, Robin Hood Hills, becomes infamous.
It does. And right from the start, your sources highlight that the timeline, even where they were last seen, was contested. There were affidavits later from neighbors who swore they saw the boys playing later than initially thought, around 6:30 p.m. And, critically, some neighbors reported seeing Steve Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, calling the boys to come home around that time.
That's a really significant detail, especially given what comes later. Was that followed up on initially?
It seems not, or at least not effectively. It feels like an early red flag, a conflicting account that just got brushed aside as the investigation quickly focused elsewhere.
The initial searches that night didn't find anything. It wasn't until the next day, May 6th, was it?
That's right. A much larger search kicked off, and then around 1:45 p.m., the horrific discovery. It was actually a juvenile parole officer who made the find. Spotted a black shoe floating in this muddy creek or ditch in Robin Hood Hills.
And the scene itself, just unimaginable.
Profoundly shocking. The bodies of all three boys were found there in the water. And the sheer brutality. It suggested something deeply personal, or at least deeply disturbing. All three had been stripped naked, and they were hogtied with their own shoelaces.
Hogtied? Can you describe that? It sounds very specific.
It is incredibly specific.
Yeah.
It means their right ankle was tied to their right wrist and the left ankle to the left wrist, all behind their backs. This immediately screamed ritualistic to the local police, whether that was actually the case or not. It planted that seed very early on.
And the victim's clothing.
Found in the creek. Some of it was twisted around sticks that had been jammed into the creek bed, just discarded.
And we have to mention, right, that 2 pairs of the boys' underwear were never recovered at all. That detail always struck me as odd.
It's a very strange detail, and it feeds into some later theories and questions. But focusing on the immediate aftermath, the autopsies revealed um, just devastating injuries. Moore and Branch, their cause of death was listed as multiple injuries with drowning.
Hmm.
Christopher Byers, however, died from multiple injuries alone. He didn't drown. And he was the one who suffered the most visible mutilation, specifically lacerations and severe injuries to his genitals.
And this is where the police immediately jumped to conclusions, wasn't it? The sexual assault angle.
Exactly. The West Memphis Police Department saw those injuries, saw the nudity, and immediately suspected sexual assault. But this is really where the investigative errors start to pile up, almost from minute one. Even their initial conclusions based on the post-mortem exams became huge points of conflict later in court.
Like the supposed evidence of rape.
Precisely. Police initially claimed the victims showed signs of rape, specifically citing dilated anuses. But later, highly credible defense experts testified very strongly against this. They explained that anal dilation is actually a known, normal post-mortem condition. It happens after death. It doesn't automatically mean sexual trauma occurred. But that initial sensationalized assumption, it fueled the narrative of some kind of brutal sexual ritual.
And the debate over Christopher Byers' specific injuries was just as fierce.
Oh, yeah. The prosecution brought in experts who argued those wounds were clearly from a knife, that it was a purposeful castration, part of this alleged ritual. But then the defense experts came in and provided really compelling, detailed arguments that the injuries were much more consistent with post-mortem animal predation.
Animal predation? Like,
Given that the bodies were in a creek, possibly turtles, maybe other small aquatic scavengers, remember the bodies were left exposed for some time. The fact that you could have two completely opposing interpretations of the same horrific injuries really underscores how ambiguous the physical evidence was from the start.
and even the location itself, the creek, was debated, wasn't it? Was that actually where the murders happened?
That's another huge question mark. The WMPD basically assumed the whole thing, assault, murder, disposal, happened right there in that muddy ditch. But critics and defense experts later pointed out that the severity of the wounds, especially Byers, should have produced a lot more blood at the scene than was apparently found. This suggests it was more likely a dump site, not the primary crime scene.
Which means the real crime scene, with potentially crucial forensic evidence, was never found or even looked for.
That's the implication. If they'd treated the creek as just the place the bodies were left, maybe they would have looked harder elsewhere. Vital evidence could have been lost right there.
It's important, too, I think, to remember who these victims were. You said second graders, best friends.
Yeah, they'd all achieved the rank of wolf in their Cub Scout pack. Just typical 8-year-old boys from a working-class area. It's also noted in the sources that Christopher Byers was the only one with medication to assist Ritalin for ADHD. A small detail, but it grounds them. These were real children, not just symbols in some imagined ritual.
And that gap between the reality of these kids and the, frankly, fantastical narrative the police seem to latch onto almost immediately. That's what leads us straight to the West Memphis Three, isn't it?
Absolutely. It felt like the focus shifted very quickly away from the scant evidence and towards finding people who fit a certain terrifying profile, a profile fueled by the times.
Yeah, the Satanic Panic era, it was gripping parts of America, especially, the Bible Belt in the late 80s and early 90s, and West Memphis seemed right in the middle of it.
It really was. And the 3 teenagers the police eventually arrested, they seemed tailor-made for that cultural paranoia. Damian Eccles, who was 18, he was clearly the main focus from early on. He was already known as an outsider. Well, he had a documented history of mental health struggles, diagnoses, including paranoia, hallucinations. He apparently received full disability benefits for it. Plus, his appearance, dressing in black, his interest in occultism, Wicca, heavy metal music, writers like Aleister Crowley. In a place like West Memphis in 1993, that made him stick out like a sore thumb.
He was basically the town's embodiment of everything they feared about rebellious youth culture. The perfect scapegoat.
You could certainly argue that.
Yeah.
Then you have Jason Baldwin, who was 16. He was a close friend of Eccles. But Baldwin was actually, by all accounts, a good student, high grades, talented at drawing. His main crime seemed to be sharing Eccles's distaste for the prevailing cultural climate, as your sources put it. He was targeted largely by association.
And the third, Jesse Miskelly Jr.
Jesse was 17. He had a bit of a reputation, apparently, for a temper, getting into fights. But the absolutely critical factor with Miskelly was his tested IQ, 72. That's borderline intellectual functioning. And that vulnerability, unfortunately, seems to be exactly what the police exploited to, quote-unquote, crack the case.
So the police, specifically officers James Sudbury and Steve Jones, they saw the hog tying, immediately thought cult, and Eccles, with his interests, just fit the bill perfectly.
It appears so. He became the prime suspect almost instantly. He took an initial polygraph, denied everything, but the examiner claimed the results showed deception. That just hardened the police's view, confirmed their bias.
But the real linchpin, the thing that allowed them to move forward with arrests, was Miskelly's interrogation and that infamous confession.
That interrogation. It's just a textbook example of potentially coercive tactics. June 3rd, 1993. Police questioned Miskelly for about 12 hours straight. Think about that context again. A 17-year-old kid, IQ of 72, questioned alone. No lawyer, no parent or guardian actually present during the questioning, even though his father gave permission for him to go with the police initially.
And the recording of it is suspicious, to say the least.
Extremely. Only about 46 minutes of that entire 12-hour period were recorded. The implication is unavoidable. Whatever pressure, whatever leading questions, whatever happened to get that confession likely occurred off tape.
And he recanted pretty quickly, didn't he?
Almost immediately. He said he was intimidated, coerced, exhausted, that he just told them what he thought they wanted to hear so it would stop. An expert on false confessions later reviewed the recorded portion and testified it was a classic example of police coercion, especially with someone of Miskelly's intellectual limitations.
And crucially, the details in the confession didn't even match the known facts of the crime scene, right?
Not even close. It was wildly inconsistent. He said the murders happened around midnight. Physical evidence pointed to much earlier. He claimed he watched Damien rape one of the boys. Forensic evidence later showed no signs of rape at all. Yet, despite all of that, the low IQ, the immediate recantation, the factual errors, the lack of full recording, the Arkansas Supreme Court later ruled that confession was voluntary. That was a huge blow to the defense.
And it wasn't just Miskelly's confession that felt pressured. There was also the testimony of Vicki Hutchison. Tell us about her role.
Right, Vicki Hutchison. She was relatively new to the area. Her young son, Aaron, apparently made some comments about the murders happening at a playhouse, which kind of fed into the police's ritual theory. Hutchison then testified under oath at the trial that she'd been at a Wiccan gathering, an Esbat, where Damien Eccles supposedly bragged about committing the murders and implicated Miskelly.
This sounds like a bombshell. It directly links Eccles and Miskelly through an admission.
It was huge for the prosecution. It provided that narrative link they needed. Eccles as the evil mastermind, Miskelly as his sort of follower or accomplice. But fast forward about 10 years to 2003.
She recanted.
Completely. Vicki Hutchison recanted her entire story. She said she fabricated everything because the police had pressured her, even making veiled threats about taking her child away if she didn't cooperate with their theory. She also made that incredible claim about seeing photos of the West Memphis Three used as dart targets at the police station. If true, that just shows an unbelievable level of contempt and bias from the investigators.
So, with the police seemingly fixated on these three teens, driven by a questionable confession and later recanted testimony, what about other potential leads? Were there any?
Oh, yes. And this is where the confirmation bias really seems blatant. Your sources mention a couple of significant ones that were barely pursued. There were two other teenagers, Chris Morgan and Brian Holland. They apparently had drug histories, and they abruptly left town, went to California right after the bodies were found. Suspicious timing, right?
Definitely. Did the police talk to them?
They did eventually. Both apparently failed polygraph exams when asked about the murders. Morgan even briefly said something like he might have killed the victims before taking it back. But the West Memphis Police Department, already convinced they had their satanic cult killers, didn't really follow up aggressively.
Unbelievable. And wasn't there something about a bleeding man?
Yes. The Mr. Bojangles incident, as became known. On the night the boys disappeared, there was a report of a black male, described as bleeding and mentally disoriented, found in the restroom of a Bojangles restaurant near Robin Hood Hills. Police were called. They took blood samples from the restroom.
Okay, that sounds like a potentially huge lead, a bleeding, distressed person near the scene on the night of the crime.
You'd think so. But then the police somehow lost those blood samples. They were never tested. And the lead wasn't really pursued. This becomes even more significant when you remember that later forensic testing found a hair belonging to an unidentified black male actually recovered from the crime scene, wrapped around one of the victims.
Wow. So actual physical evidence possibly linking back to this ignored lead.
Potentially. When you contrast the 12 hours spent grilling Miskelly versus the apparent dropping of this lead involving a bleeding man and not pursuing the teens who failed polygraphs, it really paints a picture. It suggests the investigation maybe wasn't about finding the truth, but about confirming the truth they had already decided on.
Which leads us directly into the trials themselves. and how these investigative flaws played out in court.
Right. And the first major consequence of relying so heavily on Miss Kelly's confession was that he had to be tried separately from Eccles and Baldwin.
Why was that? Explain the legal reasoning there.
It comes down to something called the Bruton Rule, which stems from a Supreme Court case. It's about protecting a defendant's Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses against them. Because Miss Kelly's confession implicated Eccles and Baldwin, but Miss Kelly himself wasn't going to testify against them. He'd recanted. They couldn't cross-examine him about the confession. If they'd all been tried together, using his confession would have violated Eccles and Baldwin's confrontation rights. So the state had to choose. Try Miss Kelly alone with the confession, or try them all together without it.
And they chose to split the trials, using the confession against Miss Kelly. That really shows how vital that confession, however flawed, was to their whole case.
Absolutely. So in the joint trial of Eccles and Baldwin, the prosecution knew they didn't have the confession. They had to lean even harder on that emotional narrative, the satanic ritual angle.
How did they build that narrative in court?
It was central. They hammered on Eccles' interests, his clothes, his reading habits, and they brought in that occult expert, D.O. Griffiths. But as your sources note, Griffiths got his Ph.D. from an unaccredited correspondence school, Columbia Pacific University. The defense did manage to challenge the scientific validity of his testimony, arguing it was speculative, but the damage was probably already done. That idea of a satanic ritual sacrifice had been planted firmly in the jury's minds.
And setting aside the occult stuff, what actual physical evidence did they present against Eccles and Baldwin?
This is where it gets almost absurdly thin. The main physical evidence boiled down to a couple of fibers. They presented 2 green threads found near the crime scene, which a state witness said were microscopically similar to a shirt found in the closet of Eccles' sister, and 1 red rayon fiber, supposedly similar to a fiber from a robe found in Baldwin's home.
Okay, let's unpack microscopically similar. What does that actually mean in forensic terms, especially back then? Does it prove anything?
Honestly, it means very, very little. Back then, fiber analysis was basically about looking at common characteristics, color, diameter, material type like cotton or rayon. If 2 fibers are microscopically similar, it just means they share those basic class characteristics. They could have come from the same source, sure, but they could also have come from literally millions of other green shirts or red robes manufactured and sold. It's not like a fingerprint or DNA.
So it's not a unique match.
Not even close. In fact, the state's own fiber expert eventually had to concede on the stand that this similarity proved nothing beyond the fact that these were common fibers. The prosecution was basically saying, look, these guys own green and red clothes, and we found tiny green and red threads nearby. That was essentially the entire weight of the physical case linking them to the scene.
Another point the prosecution hammered on was Eccles' supposed knowledge of the crime details, particularly the genital mutilation. They argued he knew things only the killer could know.
Right, and this goes back to the integrity of the investigation itself. Eccles always maintained he heard details either from the police themselves during questioning or just through rumors and news reports circulating in town. Investigative journalists later found strong indications that sensitive, specific details about the crime scene had been leaked by police, perhaps inadvertently or even deliberately. And that kind of superheated atmosphere in West Memphis, it's entirely plausible Eccles could have picked up that incriminating knowledge without ever being near the crime scene.
So beneath the surface of this satanic panic narrative, there were these profound systemic failures in the basic police work. Let's talk about those. The crime scene handling, for instance.
Oh, the crime scene management was, by multiple accounts, abysmal. Dan Stidham, who represented Miss Kelly early on, described the creek area as being literally trampled by onlookers and even officials. And crucially, the bodies were pulled out of the water before the coroner arrived to properly assess things like rigor mortis.
Why is that timing so important?
It's vital for establishing a more accurate time of death. Removing them prematurely, leaving them on the bank exposed to sun, insects, the elements. It destroys that information and complicates any later forensic analysis of the bodies themselves.
And the way they stored the evidence collected, that seems almost unbelievable.
It really is shocking for a major homicide investigation. Your sources state physical evidence was put into things like supermarket paper sacks, not secure, sterile, airtight forensic containers designed to prevent contamination. Think about trace DNA, which they couldn't test for effectively back then. Storing evidence like that could easily ruin any chance of getting viable DNA later on. It certainly gave the defense plenty to attack.
And beyond just, let's say, incompetence, there was this refusal to accept outside help.
This is a really crucial point, I think. The West Memphis Police Department reportedly refused an offer of assistance from the Arkansas State Police's violent crime experts. Why would they do that? Well, critics and later reports suggested it might be because the WMPD itself was under investigation by the state police at that very time for alleged theft from a drug task force.
Wow. So refusing help might have been about avoiding external scrutiny of their own department, not just the murder investigation.
That's the speculation, yes.
Yeah.
It suggests they might have wanted to keep control, perhaps rush to a conclusion they could manage, without outsiders looking too closely at their methods or potentially other issues within the department.
That really casts the whole investigation in a different light. It feels less like mistakes and more like a deliberate path taken.
It certainly raises questions, and you see that bias reflected early on. There's that quote from a juvenile probation officer who was at the scene, reportedly saying very early in the process something like, "Looks like Damian Eccles finally killed someone." If the people processing the scene already have their minds made up, well, the integrity of everything that follows is questionable, isn't it?
Years later, another forensic issue cropped up, possible bite marks.
Yes, this emerged well after the trials. A forensic scientist reviewing crime scene photos noticed what looked like possible human bite marks on one victim's forehead. These hadn't been noted in the original autopsy. Further analysis concluded that if they were bite marks, they did not match the dental molds taken from Eccles, Baldwin, or Miss Kelly.
And this brings John Mark Byers, Christopher's adoptive father, back into the picture in a strange way.
It does. Byers, who was initially very vocal supporting the convictions, had all his teeth removed in 1997. This was after the trial, but before any official request could be made to compare his teeth to the potential marks. He claimed it was for unrelated dental problems. It just added another layer of unresolved questions, like the possible belt buckle mark also noted later in photos. These were forensic details potentially pointing away from the convicted three, details seemingly missed or ignored at the time.
Okay, so convictions stand, appeals are denied through the normal channels for years. But the case refuses to die, largely thanks to public support and fundraising. What was the big turning point?
The big turning point was definitely advancements in DNA technology. By 2007, the science had evolved dramatically. Damian Eccles' legal team successfully petitioned for new, sophisticated DNA testing on the evidence that had been preserved, however poorly.
And the results of that 2007 DNA report were explosive.
Absolutely revolutionary for the case. The report delivered two killer blows to the state's original theory. First, it confirmed zero DNA matching Eccles, Baldwin, or Miss Kelly was found on any of the key crime scene evidence tested. Not on the victims' bodies, not on their clothes, not on the ligatures used to tie them.
So the physical evidence, retested with modern tech, showed no link whatsoever.
None. They were convicted, essentially, on no physical evidence connecting them to the crime, but the report went even further. It found DNA that didn't belong to the victims and didn't belong to the defendants.
Meaning DNA from someone else, an unknown person or persons.
Exactly. The report explicitly stated, and I'm quoting the sense of it here, some of the genetic material recovered cannot be attributed to either the victims or the defendants. There was unknown DNA at the scene. And even more specifically, one hair, found entangled in the knots used to bind one of the victims, yielded mitochondrial DNA not inconsistent with Stevie Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs.
Not inconsistent with Terry Hobbs. Okay, that's not a definitive match. But combined with the lack of DNA from the WM3, it shifts the focus dramatically, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Suddenly, Terry Hobbs, who some neighbors claimed called the boys home that night, is forensically linked, albeit not definitively, to the ligatures on one of the victims. And the suspicion around him deepened significantly in 2009 because of a sworn declaration made by Pamela Hobbs, Stevie Branch's biological mother.
What did she reveal?
Two incredibly troubling things. First, she stated that she and her sister later found a pocket knife that belonged to Stevie, one he always carried and they thought had been lost during the crime. They found it hidden away in Terry Hobbs's nightstand. He'd apparently never mentioned finding it.
That's highly suspicious. Hiding a victim's possession.
It's extremely. And the second point was about his behavior right around the time of the murders. Pamela's sister testified she saw Terry Hobbs acting strangely, specifically washing clothes, bed linens, and even curtains from Stevie's room at a very odd time, late at night or early morning, right after the boys disappeared. You put that together, the odd behavior, hiding the knife, the hair found in the knots, it creates a very strong circumstantial case, pointing suspicion squarely at Terry Hobbs.
And while all this new forensic evidence is emerging, weren't there also serious issues coming to light about the original trials themselves? Jury misconduct.
Yes, absolutely. The defense teams compiled compelling evidence of serious jury misconduct in the Eccles-Baldwin trial. It centered around the jury foreman, Kent Arnold. There were allegations, apparently backed by witnesses, that Arnold had discussed the case with an attorney friend before deliberations even began, getting outside opinions. A huge violation of rules. And worse, he was accused of bringing inadmissible evidence into the jury room specifically, talking about Miss Kelly's confession, which, remember, was explicitly barred from being considered in their trial due to the Bruton rule.
So the jury's decision-making process was potentially corrupted from the inside.
It certainly appears that way. It suggests their verdict wasn't based solely on the evidence presented in court, but on outside influence and information they legally shouldn't have had.
And there was even an allegation about the trial judge, David Burnett, wasn't there? Something about influencing the jury.
A very serious allegation. Dan Stidham, Miss Kelly's former lawyer, testified he overheard Judge Burnett make a comment to the foreman during a sidebar, something to the effect of, "You'll need food for when you come back for sentencing." End of quote. When the foreman supposedly asked, "What if we acquit?" the judge allegedly just shut the door. If true, it implies the judge presumed guilt or was signaling an expectation of guilt before the defense had even rested its case.
Okay, so faced with potentially damning new DNA evidence pointing elsewhere, proven jury misconduct, and serious questions about the trial judge, the state of Arkansas was facing a potential catastrophe, right? An evidentiary hearing would air all this dirty laundry.
Precisely. They were looking at a scenario where the entire case could collapse very publicly. The DNA, the Hobbs connection, the jury issues, the coerced confession. It was overwhelming. So they needed an exit strategy, a way to get the West Memphis Three out of prison without admitting fault, without opening the door to massive lawsuits.
And that exit strategy was the Alford plea.
Yeah. Exactly. Negotiated over time, it culminated on August 19th, 2011. It was a complex legal deal. First, the original convictions for Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly were formally vacated, wiped clean, legally speaking. Then, in the same breath, they entered Alford pleas to lesser charges, first and second-degree murder. They stood in court, verbally asserted their innocence, but acknowledged the state's evidence could have led to a conviction.
And the sentence?
Time served. After 18 years and 78 days behind bars, they were sentenced to the time they'd already spent incarcerated. And they walked out of court that day as free men.
But it wasn't quite that simple. There were strings attached, big ones. That suspended sentence, for instance.
Right. They received a 10-year suspended sentence on top of the time served, which basically means for the next decade they had to stay out of trouble. Any new offense, even minor, could potentially send them back to prison to serve out the remainder of a 21-year sentence associated with the plea. It's like a legal leash.
And the biggest string, the one that really protected the state.
The most cynical part of the deal, many would argue. As a condition of their release under the Alford plea, all three men had to agree to give up their right to sue the state of Arkansas, the police, the prosecutors, anyone involved, for wrongful conviction or imprisonment. They essentially traded their right to seek civil justice, potentially millions of dollars in damages, for their immediate freedom.
Jason Baldwin, in particular, really struggled with accepting this deal, didn't he?
He did. He was incredibly resistant.
Yeah.
On principle, he did not want to plead guilty, even via the Alford mechanism, to crimes he insisted he didn't commit. It went against everything he stood for. But ultimately, he agreed to it. And the main reason he gave was Damian Eccles. Refusing the deal would have meant Eccles stayed on death row, potentially facing execution while further appeals dragged on. Baldwin famously said something like, the deal was not justice, but they were trying to kill Damian, and he had to put his friend's life first. It just shows the agonizing choice they were forced into.
So they walk free in 2011, but under this cloud of the Alford plea. What happened next? How did the case continue to evolve?
Well, the division among the victims' families continued. But significantly, some key figures publicly shifted their positions. John Mark Byers, Christopher's adoptive father, who had been extremely hostile towards the WM3 for years, eventually came to believe they were innocent. He publicly advocated for reopening the case. And Pamela Hobbs, C.V. Branch's mother, also became a powerful voice, questioning the convictions and supporting the WM3's claims of innocence.
And what about Terry Hobbs, the focus of so much suspicion after the DNA results?
He has always maintained his innocence. He actually filed a defamation lawsuit against Natalie Mames, the singer from The Chicks, who was a vocal supporter of the WM3 and had publicly implicated him. However, that lawsuit was eventually dismissed, and Hobbs was actually ordered to pay Mames' legal costs. While not a finding of guilt, it was certainly seen by many as a blow to his credibility.
And what about independent experts, people looking at the case from the outside?
The consensus among many experienced criminal profilers and investigators strongly leans towards the WM3's innocence. Johnny Douglas, the renowned former FBI profiler who consulted with Eccles' team, he stated very clearly he believed the crime wasn't the work of three teenagers engaging in some clumsy ritual. He saw it as more likely the work of a single killer, someone with a personal motive focused on degrading and punishing the victims. He found the satanic ritual theory completely unsupported by credible evidence.
So after 18 years locked away, how did these three men, Eccles, Baldwin, and Miskelly, begin to rebuild their lives?
They've all tried to move forward in different ways. Jesse Miskelly got engaged, reportedly to his high school girlfriend, and enrolled in community college, looking to train as an auto mechanic, very practical skills. Jason Baldwin moved out west to Seattle. He found a relationship and spoke passionately about wanting to go to college and become a lawyer, specifically to help other wrongfully convicted people, toning his own trauma into advocacy.
And Damien Eccles, having spent all that time on death row.
Eccles moved initially to New York, then later to Salem, Massachusetts, an interesting choice, given the history there with his wife Lori Davis, whom he married while incarcerated. He's become quite prolific as a writer, publishing memoirs about his ordeal. He's also deeply involved in visual arts and magical practice. His art often explores themes related to his experience, like that exhibit Salem, which directly compared his case to the historical witch trials, focusing on those false accusations of ritual abuse.
But despite being free, the legal fight isn't over for them, is it? They're still seeking full exoneration.
That's right. The Alford plea got them out, but it didn't clear their names. They are still technically guilty of lesser murder charges in the eyes of the law, even though they maintain innocence. Damien Eccles, in particular, has relentlessly pursued further DNA testing on remaining crime scene evidence, hoping new technology like MVAC wet vacuum systems could finally identify the unknown DNA profiles found back in 2007. His legal team has faced obstacles, including claims that some evidence was lost or destroyed, possibly in a fire, though records of that seem unclear. But they've continued appealing, even up to the Arkansas Supreme Court as recently as 2024, fighting for access to test that evidence.
Why is that full exoneration so important, beyond just clearing their names?
Because it's not just about them, it's about finding the truth. The Alford plea allowed the state to close the book, in a way, without ever identifying who actually committed these horrific murders. Full exoneration, potentially through new DNA evidence identifying the real killer, is the only path to achieving actual justice for Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, and for their families who still don't have definitive answers.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a really unsettling final thought to wrestle with, doesn't it? What does it really say about our justice system when it takes 18 years, international outcry, millions in donations, celebrity advocates, and massive leaps in DNA technology just to expose the fundamental weaknesses of a case apparently built on little more than rumor, fear, and frankly, incompetent police work? The West Memphis Three are free, yes, but the state never had to admit it was wrong. Justice for those three little boys remains incomplete, and that failure, that lingering uncertainty, continues to cast a long shadow.